They called it a revolution, 21st century socialism, the Bolivarian dream, power to the people, oil wealth for the masses. But something went wrong. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia, 300 billion barrels buried beneath Venezuelan soil, and yet by 2024, the average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds due to malnutrition. Not in 1950, not in some distant past, in the 21st century. This isn't a story about socialism failing. This is a story about a very specific betrayal, a betrayal so complete, so systemic, that it transformed the wealthiest nation in South America into one where doctors fled to Colombia to work as waiters, where teachers make $30 a month, where mothers search through garbage for food. The betrayal has a name, Nicolás Maduro. But to understand the betrayal, you first have to understand the promise. Venezuela was tired of the old elites, tired of watching oil wealth flow into foreign bank accounts while barrios went without clean water, tired of democracy that seemed to serve everyone except the people. Then came Hugo Chávez. Chávez was a former military officer who had led a failed coup in 1992. He was imprisoned, then pardoned. And in 1998, he ran for president with a simple message: the oil belongs to the people. We will take it back. He won with 56% of the vote. What followed was a genuine transformation. Chávez nationalized oil production in 2007, taking control away from multinational corporations. He used oil revenues to fund massive social programs, free healthcare, literacy campaigns, subsidized food, housing for the poor. The numbers were remarkable. Between 1998 and 2012, extreme poverty in Venezuela dropped from 23% to 8%. University enrollment doubled. Infant mortality fell by 1/3. This was real. This wasn't propaganda. International organizations confirmed it. The UN praised Venezuela's social programs. Economists studied the Venezuelan model. Chávez called it the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simón Bolívar, the 19th century liberator who freed Latin America from Spanish colonial rule. The symbolism was powerful. A new liberation, economic liberation, liberation from imperialism, from exploitation, from the old order. And the people believed. They had evidence. Their lives were improving. Chávez became a hero not just in Venezuela, but across Latin America. In Bolivia, Evo Morales followed his model. In Ecuador, Rafael Correa did the same. The pink tide swept across the continent, left-wing governments funded by commodity wealth, promising to redistribute resources to the poor. But there was a problem. The entire system depended on one thing: high oil prices. In 2008, oil hit $140 per barrel. Venezuelan government revenues soared. Chávez spent lavishly. He bought political support with subsidies, funded allies across Latin America, built monuments to the revolution. Nobody asked, what happens when oil prices fall? In 2012, Chávez was diagnosed with cancer. He kept it secret for months, governing from a hospital bed in Cuba. The Venezuelan people didn't know how sick their president was, and when he died in March 2013, many Venezuelans wept, genuinely. They had lost a leader who, whatever his flaws, seemed to care about them. Chávez's successor was a man named Nicolás Maduro. Maduro was Chávez's vice president, a former bus driver who rose through union politics. He had been loyal to Chávez, but he lacked Chávez's charisma, his strategic vision, his ability to inspire. More importantly, he lacked Chávez's restraint, because what Maduro understood, what the inner circle understood, was this: the revolution was over. The good times were ending. Oil prices were about to collapse. And when that happened, there would be a choice. Sacrifice yourself to cushion the people's fall, or loot what you can before the ship sinks. Maduro chose the latter. The betrayal began quietly, incrementally, with decisions that individually seemed minor, but collectively formed a pattern. First, currency controls. Venezuela had maintained strict currency controls since 2003, ostensibly to prevent capital flight. The government set an official exchange rate that dramatically overvalued the Venezuelan bolivar. The official rate said $1 for 6.3 bolivars, but on the black market, $1 cost 60 bolivars, then 100, then 1,000. This created an opportunity. If you had access to dollars at the official rate, you could exchange them on the black market and make a fortune. Instantly, risk-free. But only government-connected elites had access to dollars at the official rate. Maduro's government issued something called KDV certificates, essentially permits to buy dollars at the official rate. These certificates were supposedly for importing essential goods, but there was no real oversight. Companies connected to government officials would get certificates to import goods that never arrived. They'd exchange the dollars on the black market, then pocket the difference. This wasn't corruption in the traditional sense, a few officials skimming off the top. This was systematic looting, billions of dollars annually. In 2016, the opposition-controlled National Assembly launched an investigation. They documented over $300 billion in fraudulent transactions. $300 billion, more than most countries' entire GDP. The report named names, government ministers, military generals, Maduro's family members. Maduro's response: he dissolved the National Assembly's powers and created a new constituent assembly stacked with loyalists. Second, PDVSA's collapse. PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, was the state oil company. Under Chávez, it had been inefficient but functional. It produced about 3 million barrels per day, generating massive revenues. Maduro appointed political loyalists to run PDVSA, not engineers, not oil industry experts, political operatives whose primary qualification was loyalty. The results were predictable. Production plummeted. In 2013, Venezuela produced 2.8 million barrels per day. By 2020, production had fallen to 500,000 barrels per day, an 82% collapse. This wasn't because the oil disappeared. The reserves are still there. This was operational incompetence combined with systematic theft. Equipment wasn't maintained. Refineries broke down. Skilled workers fled. And whenever PDVSA did generate revenue, much of it vanished into shell companies controlled by regime insiders. The government blamed U.S. sanctions, and sanctions did hurt, beginning in 2017. But the collapse started before sanctions, and other sanctioned countries, Iran, Russia, managed to maintain oil production. This was something different. This was deliberate destruction masked as mismanagement. Third, the military's golden business. Maduro needed the military's support to stay in power, so he made them an offer: join the looting. The military was given control of major economic sectors: food distribution, mining, ports, construction, not to run them efficiently, but to extract wealth. One example, the Arco Minero del Orinoco. This was supposed to be a mining development zone in southern Venezuela, tapping into gold, diamonds, and other minerals. The military controlled access. What actually happened? Illegal mining operations run by military officers, often in partnership with Colombian guerrilla groups and Brazilian criminal organizations, environmental devastation, indigenous communities displaced, and the profits, they didn't go to the Venezuelan treasury, they went to generals' bank accounts. By 2020, estimates suggested military officers had extracted over $10 billion from illegal gold mining alone. Maduro didn't stop this. He encouraged it. Because a military getting rich from corruption is a military that won't launch a coup. Fourth, crypto schemes. As the economy collapsed and international sanctions tightened, Maduro needed new ways to move money. His solution: cryptocurrency. In 2018, Venezuela launched the Petro, supposedly a cryptocurrency backed by Venezuelan oil reserves. The government claimed it raised $5 billion in a pre-sale. No independent verification was ever provided. No blockchain was ever made fully transparent. No investor could actually redeem Petros for oil. The Petro was essentially a scam, a way to extract money from desperate investors while bypassing international financial restrictions. But it served another purpose. It allowed regime insiders to launder money, convert bolivars to petro, petro to Bitcoin, Bitcoin to dollars in foreign accounts. By 2023, the petro was effectively dead, but by then, it had served its purpose. While the elite enriched themselves, ordinary Venezuelans experienced something unprecedented in a peacetime, oil-rich nation: economic collapse. The numbers are staggering. Between 2013 and 2020, Venezuela's GDP contracted by 75%. Not a recession, not a depression, a civilizational collapse. To put this in perspective, during the Great Depression, US GDP fell by 30%. During Venezuela's collapse, GDP fell by 75%. Hyperinflation reached levels rarely seen outside of war zones. In 2018, inflation hit 130,000%. In 2019, it reached 9,585%. Prices doubled every 19 days. Imagine living in that reality. You wake up Monday, bread costs 1,000 bolivars. By Friday, it costs 2,000. By the next Friday, 4,000. Your salary, paid monthly, is worthless by mid-month. People stopped using bolivars for anything except immediate transactions. They switched to dollars, barter, mobile payment apps, anything but the national currency. The government's response? Print more money, which made inflation worse, which required printing even more money, a death spiral, but the human cost went beyond statistics. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines. Cancer patients couldn't get chemotherapy, diabetics couldn't get insulin, women gave birth without anesthesia because hospitals had none. A 2018 study by Venezuelan medical organizations found that infant mortality had increased by 30% in just 2 years. Maternal mortality had increased by 65%. Diseases that had been eradicated, malaria, measles, diphtheria, returned. This wasn't happening in a poor country with no resources. This was happening in a country with the world's largest oil reserves. Schools closed because teachers couldn't survive on 30-a-month salaries. University professors became Uber drivers in Colombia. Doctors crossed the border to work in Brazilian clinics. By 2024, over 7.7 million Venezuelans had fled the country, out of a population of 28 million. That's more than 1 in 4, the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. They walked across borders, thousands of miles on foot, carrying children, leaving everything behind, desperate to escape. This exodus included everyone: doctors, engineers, teachers, skilled workers, the people Venezuela needed most to rebuild. And while this was happening, while people were starving, while hospitals had no medicine, while the educated fled, Maduro's inner circle was getting rich. Let's be specific about the beneficiaries. Tarek el-Aissami, Maduro's vice president from 2017 to 2018, then oil minister. The U.S. Treasury Department accused him of drug trafficking and money laundering. They claimed he accumulated over $3 billion through corrupt schemes. Diosdado Cabello, president of the Constituent Assembly, widely considered Venezuela's second most powerful figure. U.S. prosecutors accused him of leading the Cartel of the Suns, a network of military officers involved in drug trafficking. His estimated wealth, over $1 billion. Alex Saab, a Colombian businessman who became Maduro's financial fixer. Saab created a network of shell companies to help regime officials move money abroad. He was arrested in Cape Verde in 2020, then extradited to the U.S. in 2021. American prosecutors documented how he helped steal hundreds of millions through fraudulent food import schemes. And then there's Maduro's family. Maduro's stepsons, known as Los Chamos, were arrested by DEA agents in Haiti in 2015. They had been trying to arrange a massive cocaine shipment. They're now serving 18-year sentences in U.S. prisons. Maduro's wife, Celia Flores, a former attorney, has family members also implicated in drug trafficking. Her nephews were convicted in U.S. courts. This isn't alleged corruption. These are documented legal cases, prosecutions, convictions. But here's the crucial point. None of this was invisible. The Venezuelan people could see it. They saw government officials' children posting Instagram photos from luxury vacations in Dubai, Milan, Miami. They saw the private jets, the designer clothes, the million-dollar watches. While a teacher in Caracas made $30 a month, a minister's daughter posted photos wearing a $15,000 dress. The regime didn't even try to hide it. The opulence was flaunted because by that point, the regime's strategy wasn't about legitimacy, it was about demonstrating power. The message was, we can do this and you can't stop us. But how did Maduro survive? Most leaders presiding over this scale of catastrophe would be overthrown, either by popular uprising, military coup, or international intervention. Maduro survived through a combination of factors. First, repression. Maduro built a sophisticated security apparatus, not just the military but parallel structures, colectivos, armed pro-government militias that intimidate opposition, CBIN and DGCIM, intelligence services that monitor, arrest, and torture dissidents. Protesters were met with violence. In 2014, 2017, and 2019, waves of protests swept Venezuela. Each time, government forces responded with bullets. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested, many were tortured. The UN Human Rights Council documented systematic use of excessive force, extrajudicial killings, and torture. This wasn't random violence, this was calculated repression. Second, foreign support. Russia provided financial backing and military advisors. China provided loans, over $60 billion since 2007, in exchange for future oil deliveries. Cuba sent intelligence operatives to help run Venezuela's security services. These weren't ideological alliances. These were transactional relationships. Russia wanted a foothold in Latin America. China wanted oil. Cuba wanted subsidized Venezuelan oil and cash payments. But this support gave Maduro breathing room. When the economy collapsed, Russian and Chinese credit kept the regime afloat. When protesters filled the streets, Cuban advisors helped coordinate repression. Third, fragmented opposition. The Venezuelan opposition was divided. Multiple leaders claiming to represent the democratic alternative. Infighting, disagreements over strategy, negotiate with Maduro or demand his immediate departure. In 2019, Juan Guaidó, head of the National Assembly, declared himself interim president. Over 50 countries recognized him, including the United States and most of Latin America. But recognition didn't translate to power. Guaidó couldn't access Venezuela's foreign assets. They were tied up in legal disputes. He couldn't command the military. Officers loyal to Maduro controlled the guns. He couldn't organize a unified opposition, too many competing factions. By 2023, Guaidó's interim presidency had collapsed. The opposition was back to square one. Fourth, sanctions complications. The United States and European Union imposed sanctions on Venezuela, trying to pressure Maduro to step down. These sanctions targeted oil exports, financial transactions, and regime officials. The sanctions hurt the regime, but they also provided a scapegoat. Maduro blamed every problem on economic warfare by the United States. Food shortages, American sanctions, medicine shortages, American sanctions, hyperinflation, American sanctions. This wasn't entirely false. Sanctions did worsen conditions. But the collapse had started before the harshest sanctions were imposed. The corruption, the mismanagement, the looting, that was homegrown. Still, the sanctions narrative resonated with some Venezuelans, particularly those still loyal to Chávez's legacy, who wanted to believe the revolution was betrayed by external enemies, not internal corruption. But nobody was asking the deeper question: why? Why would Maduro destroy the country he governed? What's the logic of looting a nation into collapse? The answer is cold but simple: exit strategy. Maduro and his inner circle understood something fundamental. The Bolivarian revolution was over. The social programs were unsustainable once oil prices fell. The economic model had no diversification. Everything depended on oil. They had two options. Option A, attempt structural reforms, diversify the economy, reduce spending, accept austerity, risk losing power in the process, potentially facing prosecution for previous corruption. Option B, loot as much as possible while maintaining just enough control to avoid being overthrown. Transfer wealth abroad, create foreign safe havens. Then, if the regime eventually falls, retire comfortably in exile. Option B was rational from a purely self-interested perspective, and that's what they chose. This explains why the regime didn't try to fix PDVSA. Fixing it would require transparency, which would expose the looting. Better to let it collapse while extracting what you can. This explains why they didn't address hyperinflation. Addressing it would require fiscal discipline, which would cut off the money flow to loyalists. Better to let the currency die while moving your wealth into dollars and crypto. This explains why they didn't care about the refugee crisis. Those fleeing were mostly educated professionals, potential opposition leaders. Their departure weakened the opposition and removed witnesses to the regime's crimes. It's sociopathic, but it's coherent, and it reveals the fundamental nature of the betrayal. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't socialism failing. This was a deliberate extraction scheme masquerading as governance. Let's return to the original promise. The Bolivarian Revolution, 21st century socialism, power to the people. Chávez, whatever his flaws, believed in something. He believed oil wealth should benefit ordinary Venezuelans. He believed in reducing poverty. He believed in challenging American dominance. His methods were flawed. His economic policies were unsustainable. His centralization of power created the very vulnerabilities Maduro would exploit. But there was a genuine ideological commitment. Maduro's ideology is different. It's the ideology of kleptocracy, the belief that power exists to enrich those who hold it, that the state is a mechanism for extraction, not service. The transformation is visible in the symbols. Chávez wore simple clothes, spoke to crowds in barrios, emphasized his humble origins. Maduro's wife wears designer dresses, his allies fly private jets, his children live in luxury. The regime still uses socialist rhetoric, still invokes Chávez's name, still claims to represent the people against imperialism. But the reality is visible to anyone paying attention. This isn't socialism, this is oligarchy, a small elite controlling the nation's wealth while the population suffers. In fact, Venezuela under Maduro has created more inequality than existed before Chávez. The Gini coefficient, a measure of income inequality, has worsened. The poor are poorer. The connected elite are fabulously wealthy. This is the ultimate betrayal, not just of Chávez's vision, but of everyone who believed in that vision. Every Venezuelan who thought the revolution would create a more just society. Every person who defended Chávez internationally, who argued that Venezuela represented an alternative to neoliberalism, they were all betrayed. By 2024, Venezuela had become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when institutions are weak, when power is centralized, when corruption is systematic, when leaders prioritize personal enrichment over national welfare. But it's also a lesson about the nature of betrayal, because betrayal isn't always dramatic. It's not always a single shocking act. Sometimes betrayal is gradual, a series of small compromises, each individually justifiable. We need to maintain power to continue the revolution. We need to reward loyalists to prevent a coup. We need to move money abroad just in case. But collectively, those compromises transform revolution into theft. The Venezuelan people weren't stupid. They saw what was happening. But what could they do? The regime controlled the military, the police, the courts, the electoral system. Protest, and you might be shot. Speak out, and you might be arrested. Organize opposition, and you might be tortured. So millions fled, not because they wanted to leave their country, because staying meant watching their children starve while the elite lived in luxury. And here's the final insult. The regime is still there. Maduro is still in power. The elections are still rigged. The military is still loyal. The looting continues. Because ultimately, the betrayal succeeded. Maduro and his circle extracted billions. They have foreign bank accounts, properties abroad, safe havens arranged. Even if the regime falls tomorrow, most will escape prosecution. They'll live comfortably in exile while Venezuela spends decades trying to rebuild from the ruins they created. This is the cost of betrayal at the national level. Not just destroyed institutions or economic collapse, but the loss of trust, the loss of hope. The knowledge that the revolution you believed in was hijacked by people who cared only about themselves. So what does this teach us? First, revolutionary leaders are not saints. Chávez created the conditions that enabled Maduro's betrayal. By centralizing power, by weakening institutions, by tolerating corruption among loyalists, Chávez built a system that was always vulnerable to capture by someone less principled. Second, oil wealth is a curse without institutions. Venezuela's oil should have been a blessing. Instead, it became the mechanism of the nation's destruction. Because when institutions are weak, resource wealth doesn't create prosperity. It creates incentives for looting. Third, international support matters. Russia, China, and Cuba kept Maduro in power. Without their support, financial, military, intelligence, the regime might have collapsed years ago. This was enabled by great power competition. Venezuela became a proxy battlefield where ordinary Venezuelans paid the price. Fourth, betrayal at scale requires systems, not just individuals. Maduro didn't loot Venezuela alone. He built a network, military officers, government officials, business cronies, foreign collaborators. Each had a stake in the system. Each had a role. Systematic betrayal requires systematic complicity. And finally, the cost is always paid by the powerless. The elite who looted Venezuela are fine. They're living in Miami, Madrid, Panama City. The people who believed in the revolution, they're in refugee camps, working menial jobs in foreign countries, sending money back to family members who couldn't flee. That's the reality of the Maduro betrayal, not an abstract geopolitical story, but millions of human lives destroyed by leaders who chose theft over service. Venezuela still has the world's largest oil reserves. Those reserves haven't disappeared. They're still there, beneath Venezuelan soil, worth trillions of dollars at current prices. But Venezuela can't access that wealth because the institutions needed to extract it, refine it, sell it. Those institutions were destroyed deliberately, systematically, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Rebuilding those institutions will take decades, and it will require something Venezuela currently lacks: trust. Trust that leaders will serve the people, not loot them. Trust that institutions will function fairly, not as extraction mechanisms. Trust that oil wealth will benefit the nation, not just the elite. That trust has been shattered, and rebuilding trust is harder than rebuilding refineries. This is Maduro's legacy, not just poverty and collapse, but betrayal so complete that it destroyed the possibility of collective faith in governance. The revolution promised power to the people. What it delivered was a masterclass in how power corrupts, how revolutions can be hijacked, how rhetoric about the people can disguise the most cynical form of elite theft. The Bolivarian dream is dead, and Nicolás Maduro killed it. Not with a dramatic act, with 1,000 small betrayals that added up to civilizational collapse. And the ultimate tragedy? He's still there, still in power, still living comfortably while the nation he destroyed tries to survive. That's the story nobody wants to tell, because it's too uncomfortable, too complex, too damning of simple narratives about socialism or imperialism or revolution. But it's the truth. A truth visible in every Venezuelan refugee, every closed hospital, every collapsed refinery, every luxury Instagram post from a regime official's child. The truth of betrayal, systematic, complete, unrepentant, and ongoing.